Welcome back, everyone. It's Hari here with week 5 of YSP's spring 5th grade curriculum. This week's lesson is titled Photosynthesis, but that is not everything that's happening in this lesson. Even after a quick reading through the lesson plan, you'll notice that there's kind of two different ideas that you're going to present to your class or that you're going to discuss with your class, and this lesson is kind of a balancing act between those two, alternating back and forth just to make sure the students understand what's happening in the experiment and the lesson itself, because those two, while they are connected, they aren't exactly directly related as previous experiments have been. Let's go ahead and get started looking at the materials. The first one that I want to talk about is the food dye. If you check in your bag, you need to make sure that you have enough to put 20 drops per cup, which is about 20 drops per group. Each group will get their own cup, and it would be preferable if you had multiple colors to give to different groups. That would make the experiment more lively because all the flowers would be turning different colors, and it's just a little bit more fun. But if that's not the case, do not worry. The students will still enjoy the reaction of just, say, all their flowers turning blue, because it's still pretty cool to see something of that magnitude happen. All right, moving on past that, you'll notice that the NGSS objective for this talks about supporting an argument that plants get the materials they need for growth chiefly from air and water. And that's kind of hinting at the fact that we need to impart the knowledge on these 5th graders that photosynthesis occurs. And we've been working on the past couple of weeks talking about the plant cells and chloroplasts and how that matters into getting the plants the nutrients it needs. And the big thing that you're going to be talking about here is the chemical reaction associated with photosynthesis. Again, we did cover chemical reactions both at the end of the fall and the beginning of the spring, so that can be something you review before you get into today's lesson. But apart from the photosynthesis, there are these concepts of transpiration and capillary action, which are pretty complicated for a 5th grade science class, but those are the concepts that are more associated with the experiment we're doing, whereas photosynthesis is the concept that's more associated with the lesson that's supposed to be taking place. All right, moving on to engagement. I left a little note here at the beginning of engagement that doesn't really relate to the engagement, but you want to start the experiment, meaning set up the flowers in your cup, add the food coloring, add the water, as soon as possible. And I'll go over that later once we get to the exploration section, but it will be important that you start early so you can potentially see results within your hour or hour and a half of lesson time. Now going on to some of the brainstorming ideas you can do. Using maybe the document projector or the whiteboard, you can have them make a brainstorming web or suggest ideas of answering the question, what do plants need in order to grow, like soil or water or sunlight or so on and so forth. And that's a way to kind of introduce them to this idea of photosynthesis and lead into the question, how does a plant make its own food? And now this is where the balancing act that I was talking about comes in. You need to be careful that your students think of this as a completely detached topic from the flowers or the carnations that you were working with when you set up the experiment earlier in the lesson. While yes, that is important to the lesson overall, it doesn't really answer the question, how does a plant make its own food? It more talks about the traveling of the water up the stem. So that's why a brainstorming activity before the question is super important to get those ideas flowing so they can kind of get their minds off the experiment and come back to it later, because we're going to be going back to it later when we're discussing what's actually happening within the flower itself. Moving on, let's take a look at exploration. A lot of these pictures are fairly self-explanatory. You can talk through them or play a video or something to kind of get the idea across to your students. But I want to look at this procedure bullet point number 8. So the worksheet that you're going to be handing out to your students, I'm not sure if it's a worksheet or you'll be having them draw a data table in their science notebooks, but regardless, it recommends that you have them observe at 10, 20, and 30 minutes those intervals throughout the lesson, but chances are that you're going to get no result of your flowers changing color, both at 10 or at 20 or even 30 minutes of your lesson. So another way you can alter that, there's a comment about it on the side. You can say beginning of the lesson when you first start, because you started your lesson right away with the experiment. Maybe end of the lesson, potentially there could be some change, really, really slight, but nothing too drastic. And then this is a key one right here, Communicate with the classroom teacher to take a few minutes to observe the flowers and describe them in the science journals the next day. If they can include an overnight or tomorrow section in that data table, that allows them to really see the results and really be able to take note of what happened, because it takes that long for the experiment to run to completion and produce a good, visible result for the students. Now, by the time you're going to the conclusion section of your science notebooks, this is kind of near the end of the lesson. This is where stuff can get a little bit complicated, because even though you're trying to answer the question, how do plants make their own food, students are going to be tempted to talk about the flowers. And that's okay, because they did learn about what's happening here, but it's up to you to navigate how you want the students to be able to manage that. Do you want to give them free rein to talk about both the flowers or what's happening in the process of photosynthesis? Do you want them to just focus on the flowers? As long as they're getting something out of the lesson, that's what the goal is right here. Looking at this explanation section, a lot of this stuff about transpiration does seem pretty complicated, so boiling it down, making it a little bit more manageable, or finding a video would work well in this situation. But yeah, I think that's it for week 5, the lesson on photosynthesis. One last comment. They should be free to take the flowers home the next day, but make sure you can confirm with your teacher about that. That'll be pretty cool. They get to take home a piece of the lesson. Alright, I'll see you next week for week 6, chromatography.